I'm especially looking forward to listening to. And we've got BAFTA-winning writer Stephen Volk with us. He, of course, is best known as the creator of that wonderful paranormal drama series, Afterlife, and the notorious BBC TV Halloween hoax Ghost Watch. And Stephen's screenplays include The Awakening, starring Rebecca Hall and Dominic West, Ken Russell's Gothic, starring Gabriel Byrne and Natasha Richardson, and The Guardian, which was directed by William Friedkin. And Stephen will be chairing the panel for us on ghost fiction and ghost fact, and it's with great pleasure that I hand over to him to introduce the show of the
So now you don't know where anyone is. I'm Simon, cope with it.
Hello, that's much better. Right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Llewellyn Probert. I am the author of 5 short story collections. I've written a haunted house novel called The House That Death Built, that came out last year, and my novella, The 9 Deaths of Dr. Valentine, in which people are murdered horribly in the ways in which people die in Vincent Price movies, is currently nominated for the British Fantasy Award.
Why did anybody say You probably have, yes. Anyway, so
yes, I'm Reece, Shearsmith, actor, writer, and fan of horror and ghosts and things.
Did you hear me the first time? Right, this way.
This could only get better. Well, maybe not. I'd like to know, first of all, what drew you to supernatural writing or ghostly fiction, and who are the masters of ghost fiction that most influenced you early on? I'm not going to go to specific people in rotation. I'll just kind of come up with a question, and whoever wants to take that first.
I've got a quick answer, really. My mum always said that everyone's very different, and I was drawn to supernatural horror fiction. It's just the way my mum put my hat on. I don't try and analyse why I love this sort of stuff, and I just go with it and enjoy it. Analysing it sort of takes away some of the enjoyment sometimes, I think. Sort of a, not role model, but influences quite varied, but I'd say Stephen King, obviously, is a big horror writer. Arthur Machen, I'm a massive fan of, because I live very close to where Machen used to walk and drink. The Hanbury Arms in Killeen, one of my favourite pubs. Machen had a little seat there. And for a time they had a portrait of Machen on the wall, on the bar, and they had a sooty collecting tin in front of him. And every time I went in, I'd say to the landlord, Joe, that is behind sooty, and I'd move it, and every time I went back, they'd put sooty in front of him again. So they obviously didn't really know who he was.
I recently had the pleasure of narrating for an audio series of Robert Aikman's short, strange stories, and he's a huge inspiration to me, I think. This is the creeping dread in a very kind of insidious way. The stories that leave you, there's never really a denouement in any of Aikman. It's just kind of the subtleties that I think are the thing that's so powerful about him. And in stories the way you don't have a resolution, so you quite literally left haunted. And I think he's one of a really cherishable writer that not a lot of people should that people know about. But I think it was a joy to read his work, and I think Stephen King as well is a big influence. I like a horror that's seated in the mundane and the real, not your gothic. I mean, obviously it's great to have gothic haunted house tales, but it's lovely to have the ghost in the radiator, and that's, I think, always very creepy when it suddenly pertains to your normal life.
Well, seeing as nobody's mentioned him so far, I'm going to mention M.R. James. Actually, I didn't get to read his stuff until quite late on in life, it sounds as if. Anyway, never mind. A little later on than the stuff I started off with. I grew up in a household that didn't like horror, didn't like ghost stories, didn't like anything like that at all. And so the only horror fiction that I could find was the Pan Book of Horror Stories in the local newsagents. And one of the stories that I remember very vividly scaring the living daylights out of me in that series was actually in volume number 20. And it was a story by a chap called Carl Schiffman, which was a pseudonym, but it was called A Smell of Fresh Paint. And it was about a couple who moved into a house, and the wife is convinced she can smell paint in one of the bedrooms. And anyway, eventually the wife goes insane, she cooks the family cat, etc., etc. But the guy ends up stripping all the wallpaper off this room, and there's a door that's been papered over. And he opens the door, and there's what look like a few rags in this cupboard. But then he realises that the rags are wearing some tatters of clothing. And then this tiny bit of skin and bone turns, and it opens an eye, and it looks at him. And then he runs, and the rest of the story is the description of this thing just behind him, breathing on his neck, tearing at him with talons. And I thought, oh God, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever read. And a few years later, I found out that this was one of many stories written in the style of M.R. James. And so I picked up his stuff and I loved it. And I'll just very quickly say, Ron Chetwynd Hayes' huge influence on me when I was younger, because he was able to combine horror with humour as well, which not many people do and not many people are very good at. And also Nigel Neal, who I love because he combines science and the supernatural, which is the best of all.
John's just stolen all of my influences. M.R. James is the big one for me. I came across M.R. James's collected short stories when I was about 8 years old, in the top room of my grandparents' house, where I used to go to avoid the family arguments that happened around the Sunday lunch table. And I read M.R. James cover to cover, and then I read Stephen King's Carrie, and things have gone downhill ever since then. More modern authors that I think have been an influence on me, there's an American called T.E.D. Klein, who wrote a number of novellas and one novel that were just magnificent, and then he got writer's block and just doesn't write anymore, and it's a huge shame, but his stuff is fantastic. It's that stuff about being set in the mundane, it's in versions of worlds I recognise, and they're genuinely terrifying. And I've been trying most of my writing career to rip off M.R. James and T.D. Klein and failing miserably, but it's good fun trying, so.
Great. I'd like to ask now, because I think this is the kind of core of why this panel is a part of this weekend. Have you had any supernatural experience yourself, or paranormal experience? And how does your personal belief system, or lack of it, affect your stories of the supernatural? Starting with you.
I'm kind of with Fox Mulder on this one. I want to believe, but I have no proof of anything. And I'm of the opinion that what I want to, I don't know what I want to believe in, but I want there to be something, and I want there to be something that someone can explain to me. I haven't had any particular supernatural experiences, although I had some strange experiences in a flat at university. When I look back, I think it's because I was thoroughly miserable that year, and I think it's that interpretive stuff. And I had a very odd experience in a park one late at night where the light was very strange. I was walking my dog with my dad, and that was really creepy. That's it. I've spent my whole life, I think, when I write my stories, I'm writing about the worlds that I want to open up and that I would kind of like to be real, but that I've never found any real sort of evidence of. But I keep looking, I keep enjoying looking.
As far as I'm aware, I've never had a supernatural experience. But how do I know? How do I know that I haven't met someone who is a ghost, but appeared like you, madam, completely flesh and blood and unable to see through? How do I know I haven't had a supernatural experience? And I think that's certainly part of the fun of writing ghost stories. How do we know that 3 of us in this room now aren't ghosts? How would you know? Because we still haven't set specific scientific parameters as to what exactly a supernatural experience is. Now, you talk about belief systems. I was trained as a scientist, and I'm an atheist, but that does open my mind to all possibilities. And in terms of science, you have to think of all the possibilities. And it may be like aliens. We always think that aliens may be things that will land from Mars and be green and have several eyes, but they may be a gas, they may be a state of matter that we're not familiar with. Ghosts might be around us all the time, but we just lack the capabilities to be able to detect or appreciate them.
Well, I weirdly have had a supernatural experience, which I actually emailed C.J. Romans trying to explain to me, and he gave me one explanation, but I didn't quite buy it. And it was this. Last year begins with me winning a BAFTA for the reason I was at a hotel, because in the BAFTA goodie bag you got a free night in a hotel. So I went with my wife. I never do anything this type of thing, but we thought, yes, let's do it. It was this hotel in Cheltenham. They went to this hotel in Cheltenham. It was 8 o'clock in the restaurant downstairs in the hotel. And there were 2 wine glasses on a marble table, and we were just looking silently at the hour. Painting a horrible picture of marriage. Of the menus, and suddenly, literally, one of my wine glass just started to go like that, and I went, huh. And it pushed its way under my wife's menu. She was like that, and it was absolutely astonishing. It was so astonishing because it was like it was so. It felt so natural to see it, because you see it all the time in ghost things, when things move by themselves, but it was really happening. And I picked it up like this, and I thought, well, at first I wasn't disturbed by it, because I thought it's moving on, it's aquaplaning, which is what the possible explanation was, that it's on this surface and it's all wet and it's just sliding along. But I went like that and stopped it, and then I put it back down, and I tried to push it on the marble top, and it was actually, there was a lot of resistance to that. It wasn't smooth at all. And then the waitress came and said, "You want wine?" We said no, and she just whisked the wine glass away, and it was gone. And this entire thing just happened in this 45 seconds in the middle of this restaurant. And I thought, my God, that literally is the first time it literally called into question. I could not explain it, and I was putting pound coins on the table to see if there was a roll to it, but there wasn't. So it was a very enjoyable thing to witness. It didn't frighten me or rattle me, or change my opinion really that there are ghosts. I don't believe there are. I think the mind is a powerful thing, and I think people have the predilection to want to believe, and there's a lot of drama in people, and I think that you can create all kinds of things. And yet, there I was trying to rationalise it, but I can't think of an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of earth tremor. You go, how far-reaching do you want to go to finally decide there is an explanation? But that was it. It was very exciting for me. And I did once, when I was little, think I saw a huge face of a gypsy in my bedroom window, but I think it was a dream.
Supernatural is a strange word, because for me it just describes the natural that hasn't been explained yet. And if there's lots, humans are quite pompous sometimes. We think we're on the verge of knowing everything, and we don't. There's an awful lot we don't know, and I suspect we'll never know. My only slight experience was when I was about 10. I was lying in bed, had a terrible cough. My dad, miserable old bugger, instead of I'll have some Benadryl, he said, "Stop that noise!" So I was lying in bed, struggling not to cough. And I was lying on my left-hand side, and I heard, just getting closer, like that, and it was like a heartbeat, and just before it reached me I sat up like this, crapping myself, turned over, lay on, and I didn't sleep on my left hand side for a long time. I know now it was probably my heartbeat, but at the time, as a young kid, it did scare me quite a bit. And I've only for a very short time I thought that was a weird supernatural experience, but it troubled me a little bit. I'm a complete skeptic, like I say. I don't believe that ghosts are dead people haunting us. I think, like Reece said, we got very powerful imaginations, and that's I think that's where it all comes from, really. What about you, Steve?
Well, Tim and I were talking last night and earlier about the fact that most of the horror writers we know, most of the supernatural fiction writers we know, are skeptical people, and I think that might be surprising to the audience here today, but it's not a given that because you enjoy writing ghost stories about the supernatural that you necessarily believe it, and it's something that's very awkward to try and explain to people sometimes.
Well, I was going to say, in fact, it's the very opposite. One of our colleagues and a good friend of ours, Ramsey Campbell, is famous for saying that it actually becomes more difficult to believe this stuff if you're in the business of making it up, which is what we all are.
That's a good point. Good point.
You should know that Ramsey spent a lot of his career not believing, but he has had a supernatural experience. Has he told you about it? I'm not sure. Well, I shouldn't tell Ramsey's story for himself. Anyone aware of Ramsey Campbell's work? I mean, for a long time he was a complete skeptic, and he's written the most wonderful ghost stories. But I won't go into the whole story, but he's changed his mind. I think basically there's a room in his house where something very strange happens and has happened, and it's interesting that he's an open-minded skeptic. I guess I am as well. I'm still waiting for something to happen.
From that, I'd like to lead towards what do you think is the difference between a ghost story on page and the nature of a supernatural experience in real life? In other words, or an additional sub-question, do ghost stories really reflect what people genuinely experience, or do they perhaps affect what people genuinely experience?
I was thinking about this the other day. It's very rare, actually, that you find, not literally that question. Imagine been literally thinking of that question. Just the idea of being really frightened and what it's like when you're actually genuinely frightened. There's been a few times when I've been really frightened, rarely ever in a horror film, genuinely frightened. And when you are, and if something actually touches you or scares you, I mean, you could be walking along late at night from the tube and somebody is walking behind you and your heart starts to beat and you start to feel like prickly heat, and that you're actually suddenly thinking, am I going to get got? Am I going to start running really fast in a minute? And the adrenaline pumps, and that's what it's like to feel really scared. And I think that's the difference between, if you can capture that in a ghost story or something supernatural that's trying to recount a story where you feel genuine terror, that's a brilliant thing, because I think it's so rare to actually achieve it. And I think if you can have the fear, and when that is touched upon in good things, when you watch something and it frightens you because you think, that's what I feel like, that's what it's like, that's what I feel it would be like, that's when you're doing, I think, something right. That's when you're touching on something that you can, as a reader or a viewer, take hold of and run with and feel the terror genuinely with it. I think that's the difference. It's often a bit romanticised, the idea of being scared in horror films or in ghost stories, or that the classic thing of don't go in there, that's where the noise is. You simply wouldn't. You'd shut the door, flush the toilet and hope the burglar that you think it might be would go away. But in horror films, people approach the darkness like in a way that I don't think you would. And I think that's one of the differences. The reality and the fiction is very different, because I think humans are not brave. I'm not, anyway.
The screenwriter William Goldman has a phenomenon he calls Hollywood moments. And a Hollywood moment is, for example, when you're in the car and you're thinking, I wonder what the weather's going to be like this afternoon. On the radio it suddenly says, this afternoon the weather is going to be dull with cloudy showers. It's that moment of coincidence when something happens that is so perfectly timed and perfectly paced that it feels as if it's coincidence, but it's not. And I think part of the problem with real life events is that often real life is, if you like, stranger than fiction. It's certainly harder to believe, and I think it's actually very difficult for us as writers to get away with some of the things that actually happen in real life, because people won't believe them if you put them in a story. So that for me is the main difference anyway.
I think that's true. I think for me as well, there's a sense that unlike the one or two experiences like the Enfield case, which is kind of quite big and very dramatic things happen, most people's supernatural experiences, from what I gather, are really very small. Their wine glasses moving a couple of feet across the table. They don't actually make particularly good fiction because there's not a lot going on there. So fiction has to start normally from those small things and normally then layers up and builds up. So fiction that actually replicates real life tends to be really quite dull because there's not a lot going on. There's very little emotional consequence to some of the real life things involved. There's no resolution a lot of the time to it, except that it just dies away and things stop and drift. If you have a story in which things just stop and drift, you're probably going to annoy your readers really immensely. There is a...
dramatic. I was thinking, to pick up on what you're saying there, that the implication of my question really I'm kind of answering in a sense is that when you're building a narrative, it's structural.
Yes.
And event reflects character reflects event, and all those things in a way take you away sometimes from what a real experience of terror or supernatural is, and sometimes you have to pare down and say, no, the event doesn't reflect the character doesn't reflect the event, to get more a sense of the everyday supernatural experience. And I think I'm just echoing what you've said really. It's a balancing act, because people obviously want characters to go through a progression in a story, or there to be an ending of sorts. So it's a balancing act. I mean, just a story that simply sounds like an event that would be a non-fiction event, wouldn't be very satisfying as a story. So, and yet a truly, a story that reflects the real psychology that's going on, you know, may have to work in a more subtle way than, say, a barnstorming Stephen King story.
And there is an almost a very good film called Urban Ghost Story that tries to do that, tries, I think, to be real. And it gets away with it right till the end, when it suddenly tries to have both a filmic ending, where people have emotional resolutions to the issues, and a real poltergeist ending in which things just drift, so there's no actual kind of consequence or end to the story. So you read through the film and you think, well, that was really good until that last bit that was really quite rubbish. But the quite rubbish bit is probably the bit that reality reflects, and it's there is a balancing act there.
There's an element, especially in film, which is if you deliver too much of an ending, people will be disappointed. If you don't give them an ending, they'll also be disappointed. So the nuance of how much of an ending, how much of an enigma you retain is well, it gives me nightmares to try and figure out what might you get to, how much you deliver, how little you deliver.
Yeah, one of the criticisms of Robert Aikman is that his stories drift and do that very thing, that there's no ending, you don't have a bit denouement, you're not satisfied. That is what I think is brilliant about them, but you can see technically...
It's the very thing that makes them memorable.
Absolutely, yeah, it's his style.
Yeah. One additional question. Is a sense of malevolence essential to a ghost story?
I'd say no. I think one of my favourite ghost stories that I've written myself was about my mother's death. And it wasn't, for me, it's not a frightening story, it's a troubling story, and it was quite cathartic to write, and it got some troubling imagery out of my head. Like I say, I'm a skeptic, but after my mother passed away, I had thoughts of seeing her, like walking into a room and seeing her in an armchair, just looking really scared and lost. And I didn't see her, and there was nothing like that. I just thought, wouldn't that be horrible? So I wrote a story about that called Discovering Ghosts, and it wasn't scary or anything. And it's one of the pieces of writing I've done that's got me most sort of reaction from readers.
And award?
No, I was nominated for an award in that one. I won next year.
Sorry.
But yeah, I don't think you need malevolence or fear. You need something just a little bit beyond, and something other, something unsettling maybe, because what I wrote about was unsettling me, but it wasn't frightening me really.
One of the great moments in Poltergeist, which they're remaking, is when before it goes horribly wrong, when they're enjoying the poltergeist activity and they're putting the child on the plane in the kitchen when they're sliding along, and it's almost like fun, it's like a ride at this moment, and yet it's one of the most horrible things because because of the normality of it and the kind of the acceptance of it, and that's before there's ghosts.
I think that picks up on what you said about when you would do that, wouldn't you?
Yes, yeah.
Well,
And the shocking bit where they're all, one of the most shocking bits in the film is when she pushes all the chairs in and then she turns around and they're all stacked up. It's really horrible because it's so kind of real. And that's not malevolent. I mean, obviously you're always going to err on becoming, it's juicier, isn't it? It's more delicious to have the ghost to be a malevolent presence, but it's equally, I don't think there's anything less frightening if you want fear. It's just the unknown, isn't it? I think you can have both. There's those stories where the ghost has never been malevolent. You often hear stories of grandmothers appearing in smells and familiar, almost comforting things coming back. They're still odd, but they're not, to that person, they're a joyous thing because they're a nod in the direction of having that person around still. But it's not necessary, but I can see in our world it's possibly more an easier thing to slip into and put in because you've got import and there's peril, and that's what you feel you need to deliver.
I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the classic Ealing anthology film Dead of Night, which is 5 ghost stories filmed in 1945, but the fourth of those is the golfing story, which is a comedy. And so I don't think ghosts need to have an element of fear or malevolence. They can be used for comedic effect quite effectively, like in that story where Basil Radford and Norton Wayne are golfing chums who decide to play a round of golf to see who's going to get the girl, and the chap who loses goes and drowns himself, and then it turns out that the other guy cheated, and so he ends up haunting him. In an amusing way. And in fact, if you're doing an anthology film, or indeed an anthology of ghost stories, you can use the comedic ghost story to quite great effect, because what you try and do is put it before the really, really scary one to make it even more scary. And in Dead of Night they do this because they put it just before the one with Michael Redgrave and the dummy, which is bloody terrifying anyway, but I think it's even more so because you've lightened everyone's mood beforehand. So yeah, I think ghosts can absolutely be used for comedic effect. And I don't mean making fun of them, I don't mean being silly, I mean you can tell a decent comic story using ghosts.
And I would agree with that. And one thing I would add is that the film critic Mark Kermode once pointed out that when we deal with ghost stories, generally in fiction at least, what we're dealing with is the remains of somebody, the leavings of somebody, and that person's death will have been a tragedy for somebody else. So actually what I try to remember when I'm writing is that ghost stories may be fearful, and they may create fear, and they may well be malevolent, but actually what they are at heart is tragedies, because they're dealing with people who have died, and the sort of emotional impact of that. Now some of the emotional impact may well be from my other characters that the ghost is not happy and therefore is, you know, doing all sorts of aggressive things. But actually, one of my stories that I'm most proud of is a story about a ghost who's just sad, and she just wants someone to belong to. She wants to be connected back into the world, and she just keeps turning up at people. It's a hotel ghost that keeps turning up at people's rooms and asking if she can turn down their sheets. And that's all she wants to do, and finally somebody says yes, and that's a mistake for the person who says yes to her, because then she doesn't leave him alone. But that's not about fear for me, that's about this poor sort of, you know, hotel maid is just sad, and she's upset about being dead, presumably. So it is fearful sometimes, but far more often it's unhappy and kind of miserable and you know, kind of depressing, really.
Moving on now, I think, to my next question. When writing about ghosts, is a knowledge of the paranormal, i.e. the history of the science of ghost investigation, etc., important? Obviously you can't research the afterlife personally, but can you research in other ways about previous cases or spiritualism, say famous ghosts, say Houdini, Conan Doyle, other ghost hunters, you know, Macken, that kind of thing? Does that have a bearing on your approach to writing supernatural stories? And there's other one if nobody wants to pick up on that thing.
There you go. I think there's a difference between truth and accuracy. I think what we have to write has to be true, in that it has to reflect something that people could recognise, and that if we are writing about ghost hunters, for example, we have to be accurate about the stuff we write about, but we can also drown things in facts. You put too much information in, you can actually lose sight of the story or the plot of the characters. So I think we do have to have a knowledge of it. We do have to, depending on the sort of story you're writing, you do have to be able to reference the histories in the past. But I don't think we need to be slavish about that, and I don't think we need to be too bound by it, because actually part of the fun is, for me at least, you put a lot of correct information in your stories, and then when you put the lies in, people will believe them because you put lots of correct information that they recognise. And that's something I do quite a lot, to be honest, because essentially I'm a professional liar. But if I build my lies on lots of reality, my lies are more realistic, and therefore I get the effect I'm looking for far better, because I've given you something to believe, I hope, that's based on stuff that you recognise in your real life, whether that's ghost hunting or working in a shop or whatever it is.
I think you could say that authenticity when you're writing a story about the implausible or downright impossible is very important.
I did a play, Jeremy Dyson, and I used to work with Andy Nyman, wrote this play, Ghost Stories, which was a play, it was kind of an anthology story series on stage, and I played a parapsychologist. The whole night is like this: you come into the theatre, you sat, and I begin a lecture about ghosts and debunking it, basically. The first 15 minutes is a lecture on the history of ghosts, and then you go into, there have only been 3 cases in my 20 years that I've worked on these things that have been giving me pause, and then I went into the stories, each one progressively more frightening than the next, and that really kind of began the night in a really interesting way, because you set the stall and then you went into these stories that kind of, it was counterintuitive because the reasons why they can't exist, and then these three that give you pause, and it was a nice, it was what you were talking about, the kind of setting up the lies and the truth and mixing both. It was just a nice structural thing that the audience kind of felt that they were on home ground. It was real, they were in their seats, but then we went into these stories that kind of took you into this, sucked you into the world and told you these stories. And theatrically it worked very well. You didn't really question the device at all, and it was a joyous thing to make people frightened in the theatre, which was a real joy for me every night to see people physically jump in. And being sick, some people were sick.
It's always very important to do your research, partly to know the kind of things that have preceded you and to make sure that you're not copying them, because that's always something that I'm worrying about. But yeah, as Simon said, it's also, it can be easy to get lost in the research and put too many facts in. And to be honest, what I always try and do is never lose sight of the story, and never lose sight of the story that I want to tell. And then basically, I will fit in whatever research will kind of back this up. I mean, in the novel that I wrote, The House of Death Bill, I wanted to have a ghost that only appeared on magnetic resonance imaging. That's partly because there's a Fritz Leiber story called In the X-Ray, and the ghost only appears on X-rays. I'd always wanted to do something where ghosts only appear on MRI, because I was thinking that the supernatural emanations affect the protons in water vapor. You could pick that up with MRI, this kind of thing. I have no idea if anybody's actually done that, but I know a lot about the actual process of MRI itself. So I've done my research from the physics side of things, so that's all accurate. Yeah, so anyway.
Oh, I've got to say something as well. No, it's okay. Just a quick thought. I'm not sure it's important, but I think for all of us here, it can't be helped having a background in supernatural, because we all love horror fiction, everyone here, and lots of people here. So it's inevitable that when I write a story, I've got a deep background in the genre, because I've read lots of ghost writers and horror writers. So it'd be an interesting experiment to get who wrote 50 Shades of Shite, whatever. Get her to write a ghost story with no ghost story background and see how it comes out. Because in the end, also, I was thinking it's not important because we deal in imagination, and I think I revel in the power of imagination, and I love it. It's why every single thing I've ever written has always had some fantastical element, and I've tried to write, I've just written a thriller. But every bit of fiction I've ever written has got a fantasy element, because it's like I said earlier, it's just the way my mum put my hat on, it's what I love. But it's inevitable, I think, that we all have a background in it.
So when he was making the film The Shining, Stanley Kubrick phoned Stephen King in the middle of the night, because of the time difference, and he said, "Steve, I've been thinking about your novel. If ghosts really exist, it means there's an afterlife. Therefore, ghost stories are basically optimistic, right?" So did Stanley completely miss the point? I could just go to the next question. It's kind of a statement, but...
Okay. In my day job, I'm a doctor. And there are a lot of things that happen in this world, and a lot of things that happen to people that you can't explain. Now, a lot of my colleagues find that frustrating, but I think it's actually rather wonderful. I like that there is so much mystery still in the world. I like there are so many things that we don't yet understand, but we might one day understand. And I think that if ghosts exist, or if ghosts were shown to me to exist, I would feel terribly optimistic about that. I would think it means that there are other things going on we can't even possibly imagine comprehending at the moment, but it means that there are other things out there. There's more to life than this, but there's much more going on there than we can't comprehend. And so, yeah, I don't think Stanley missed the point at all. I think if there is an afterlife, it makes me feel very optimistic indeed. There you go.
How do I follow that? I don't think Stanley Kubrick missed the point. I think the notion of an afterlife might well give us cause for optimism that we are able to go on. As a writer, my version of the afterlife is not always optimistic. And I think that's the right that I reserve for myself as a writer, is to write afterlives that actually are quite unpleasant places. And some of it might be, if you've not led a very good life, the thought of an afterlife might be really quite scary to you, because you're thinking that's where all my dues are paid. So I don't know if it's optimistic or not, really. I think it might be cause for optimism, but I kind of like messing around at the edges of the stuff that's far less optimistic and is actually far more malevolent and malignant and unpleasant.
I think the funny thing, going back to an earlier question and the response to the question, is that what you write in fiction and the stories that you want to tell are not necessarily representative of what you privately think or privately wish for, or that's this strange and illogical thing, is that you might choose, for whatever reason of excitement or however you want to interpret it, have really malevolent stories, but your private belief might be completely unlike that.
I'd like to go on record now and say I don't want to meet any of the fates that any of my characters have ever met, because I'm not very nice to the people in my stories. I don't think I've ever written one with a happy ending yet. And a one maybe. So, you know, and I don't know why that happens. That's just how I end up writing. That's because I write the fiction that I like to read, I think. And the fiction I like to read is the stuff that leaves me, you know, wondering about what goes on next. So there's maybe a difference between the fictional afterlife and the actual afterlife, if such a thing should exist. And maybe one's optimistic and one's not optimistic. I don't know.
Maybe it's about the desire and the repression of the desire. We want people to come back, but when they come back, they drink our blood.
Yes.
Kubrick's optimism didn't leak through into his film a bit.
I'm glad to say. Okay, I'm tempted. How are we doing for time? Can I have another question?
Of course you can. Yeah,
okay.
of course.
I think what I'm going to ask one more question and then see if anyone wants to respond. And if they don't respond, we'll ask some more questions and have a chat. How have ghosts changed? I'm thinking now in the realm of most haunted, paranormal activity. What is the influence of technology? Not necessarily modern times, but the writers reflect the scientific age that they're in, obviously. How is that reflected in literature? But in modern terms, the capturing of images nowadays, cinema and TV as modes of communication, how does that affect the ghost story, do you think? John? Yeah.
I think it's marvellous. I think we have more ways these days of scaring people than ever before. We really have. And you know, there is a saying that a new item of technology only lasts about 5 minutes before someone somewhere is writing a story about it. And yeah, the fact that, you know, maybe we have yet to develop the piece of technology that ghosts can express themselves through. Maybe we have. Maybe it's satellite TV, maybe it's the internet, maybe it's mobile phones. Certainly I think in film, the found footage genre, which has been very popular for a few years, you know, has been the way to terrify people with ghost stories. The best horror film I've seen this year, and for a couple of years, I saw a couple of weeks ago, is called The Borderlands, and it's about supernatural goings on in the West Country, and it hasn't been released yet, but it uses found footage and it uses technology, and it's absolutely terrifying, and that would be my movie recommendation of the morning, actually.
Technology, television, film. One reason I raise that is I always think about Victorian spirit photographs, and we always look back with our modern day eye and think, how was anyone ever taken in by that obvious fakery? And I'm always reminded that we're probably taken in by our own present day fakery, you know, and that people will look back in decades to think, what were they, what gullible bastards in that era, you know, then, you know, surely they would have seen that was complete nonsense. But that's actual factual ghosts. More I was thinking about the ways of telling ghost stories and the fact that ghost stories, you know, we all grew up, I'm sure I'm right in saying, with the ghost stories for Christmas that were done on the BBC, adaptations of M.I. James and Charles Dickens, absolutely wonderful televised ghost stories. And my own thought is that I grew up on those as much, if not more so, than I did on written fiction ghost stories. And the two, in my mind, at least, kind of cross-pollinate, and sometimes I can't remember whether I'm actually thinking of the M.R. James version I read, or the Signal one that was adapted by Andrew Davis on TV. They all meld together as a kind of miasma of influence, across media. But that's kind of modern life. And I think it's kind of erroneous to think that because we're writers, well, I write in other media as well as fiction, but that we're only influenced by that narrow channel of literature. I think our influences come from many different directions. And going back to a previous question very briefly, do you think, to what extent is a ghost a cultural construct? This is my kind of private semi-theory of the writer's time and place. In other words, when we're writing, to what extent inevitably we're writing in our own time capsule of now, but that's very different from the time capsule of when, say, M.O. James was writing. And his concept of what a ghost was, I would say, is very different from us in the era of paranormal activity. The way he would describe a ghost in his world, 100 odd years ago, was very different than we would contemplate Johne now to a certain extent. And are we all kind of victims in a way of the time that we're writing in, unless we resort to passage? Is that even a question or just an observation? I don't know. Anyone would chip in with that.
Well, I mean, I think your perception of a ghost is bound to be a cultural construct. It's bound to be related to the times that you live in. Another film I saw very recently is a film called Banshee Chapter, which is about something called a phenomenon known as numbers stations. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but if you tune through analog radio stations, between the frequencies, you get people reading out numbers or voices repetitively, and this is something that could be construed to be to do with ghosts. So it's another way in which ghosts can be projected. Could ghosts manifest themselves digitally? Is it possible that some digital receiving equipment could pick up phenomena? So I think far more than seeing the shade in a dress floating across, we've got all these other ways of picking things up. So it makes sense that there are all these different ways of being able to interpret what a ghost is or think that that's a ghost, because there are all these even more unexplained. The more things we discover, the more questions we create, as Ambrose Bierce once said. Yeah.
I'd like to, unless anyone wants to put something, we're almost finished, but I think, do we have time for one more? Of course. Sorry, shall I open it to questions?
Yeah, shall we?
Okay. So we've got a roaming microphone. Someone got a roaming microphone? So anyone want to? Oh. Start here at the front, please. If you can think about a second question, that would be good. So.
That last question was fascinating because M.R. James actually doesn't reflect his own time, I think. I think his apparitions reflect the violence fragment, which is a 9th century York manuscript, in which the Draugr, the ghosts of Viking folklore, were physical entities, often bony, but very, very physical. It's not so much a question as a quick observation. In 1894, the SPR did the Census of Hallucinations, where they looked at supposedly real apparitional experiences. Beck's just finished replication of it in 2010, and the one thing we found was that the ghosts in it don't appear to be culturally mediated. She found that the experiences within it were very, very, very similar to the experiences reported in 1894. Ghosts still don't...
But I bet they didn't report anything on CCTV.
No, they didn't, that's true. But they still don't walk through walls. They're still not associated with sudden drops in temperature, and the majority of ghosts still aren't transparent. Yet they're all absolute classics of the modern writing. My actual question, very quickly, nobody mentioned M.R. James. Sorry, not M.R. James. Obviously you mentioned M.R. James repeatedly. Nobody mentioned Henry James and Turn of the Screw. And to me, ambiguity is the most frightening thing of all. And I actually have been doing research on ambiguity in skeptics and believers and how they interpret ambiguous situations, because I think that's really, really interesting. But is there any love here for Henry James and that masterpiece?
Yes, yeah. And I think actually that's my favourite kind of ghost story, to be honest, the ambiguity. Is it the philosopher Probert, who said talked about the hesitation that creates a sense of the uncanny. And the true uncanny is the hesitation between believing in the supernatural and believing the alternative to believing in the supernatural, which is, I must be going crazy. And it's in that vacillation between belief and non-belief that we have a frisson of the uncanny. That's how we kind of find it. And that's what some of us always strive for, that feeling, oh shit, did I see that? Or the only alternative is, I'm losing my mind. And if you can catch that in a film, which I've spent most of my life trying to do, and a lot of paranoid thrillers or fringe kind of ghost stories trying to get that concerned with the psychology of the characters, they're not all are, but I like those stories that are in kind of the deep character that actually comes up against something that they think, oh shit, is that really in the corner of the room, or is the main truth that I'm losing my mind? And in that doubt, I think that doubt is an enormously important element in the kind of ghost stories that I like. A character doubting their experience, even if for a fragment of a second, is really important to get. And then I think, going back to what Reece said, that element of doubt, again, is trying to capture what would it be like if I experienced this in real terms, not a fictional character, but I was in the room and someone appeared or this thing moved across the table, what would I start to? And as Reece accurately said, the first thing you think is, oh, that didn't happen like that, there must be some explanation, because if it did happen, what the fuck does that mean about the laws of physics? Okay? So, like I say, that kind of frisson between belief and non-belief is really interesting kind of the storytelling, I think.
I know I'm speaking on behalf of everyone in the hall when I say let us show our appreciation for what has been a truly fascinating discussion. Thank you for being here.